Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Dick and Mary Ferraro. It's June 19th, 2023. We're in the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
First question is, why wine?
When I was a teenager, I asked my aunt that. My dad and his family immigrated from Italy in the early 19th century. And my aunt was a little older, much older than Dad. Dad was a small boy when he came here. But whenever I was over to my aunts and uncles, if I had lunch or something, there was wine on the table. And one day I said, and the same with my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents. And so they all made their own wines. And I said, Auntie, how come you drink wine? And she said, well, in Italy, she said, where we came from, the water wasn't safe to drink. And she said, wine was just, you had to buy water. And it was just about as cheap to buy wine as water. And wine was nutritious. And it was looked at as a supplement to food. And some people considered it as food. And I think the only thing I came away with was the water wasn't any good to drink. And I thought, wow, I'm glad you came here. And I was born and raised in Walla Walla, Washington, and which is now some real wine country. But it was hard to visualize that the water wasn't good to drink. Not because, and Walla Walla means many waters. And there were all kinds of good wells, and of course we had water that came out of the Blue Mountains that supplied Walla Walla with domestic water. And so that kind of left an impression with me. My first experience with wine was when my dad, I think I was about 6 years old, and Dad said, we got to go help Grandpa make wine. Okay. So we went to the train station and unloaded I didn't do it, I was too young, unloaded boxcars full of grapes. And they came from California. And this had to be late 1940s, 48, 49. And we put the grapes on Grandpa's truck, took them down to his farm, and processed them. And I remember somebody handed me some juice that was coming out of the crusher, and it was Moscato. Beautiful juice. I had never tasted grape juice like that. And the next one that we did was Zinfandel. So they did Moscato for white, Zinfandel for red. And the juice was wonderful. And I said, wow, this is great. About 2 weeks later, Dad said, we got to go help Grandpa drain the wine. I said, okay. So I was anticipating that same wonderful juice, and I stuck a glass underneath the press. And I said, oh, Grandpa, I said, this stuff went bad. Everybody smiled. And that was kind of the last time I think I ever drank any wine, because it was always available. I really didn't like it. Growing up in Walla Walla was interesting. There was a large Italian settlement there. Most of them grew Walla Walla sweet onions and were gardeners. Everybody had 15, 20 acres. And there was a gardeners association where they took their onions and vegetables. It was a packing house and marketing thing. And when my grandfather, Dominic Gliacano, was the president of that thing in the 40s, he organized a consolidated purchase of grapes out of California. And he went to California, took a train, and went there to negotiate price and quality. And I never knew exactly what he meant by quality, but I found something on the internet that was kind of interesting. It was I don't know if you can see that, but that was on the side of the boxes that came in. And it was from, he dealt with somebody called the Riolo brothers, who I don't think are still in business. But one of the things it says on there is that the grapes weren't irrigated. And that was something I later found out in winemaking that was controversial with vineyard owners. And that says not irrigated. But all the boxes came in about 25-pound boxes. They were crates, wooden crates. And when I was about 10 or 12, I was old enough to unload them. And anyway, a lot of the Italian immigrants there made their own wines. And that was kind of interesting. I really had no interest in the wines at that time. It was always offered, but I always declined. I don't think it was until I'm sorry, Mary, do you have anything to say?
No, I'm listening to you. I was
doing all the talking here.
That's fine.
Bring her in, don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry.
I don't think I got into wines until I was almost in my 30s. And
Didn't your grandfather,
pardon?
didn't grandfather Dominic brought you downstairs
there
and
was one, I
said
think-
somebody needed to carry on the wine tradition, and he thought this one was the right one to do it.
Yeah, I think one day after graduating from college, I went to University of Portland, graduated from there, went down to my grandmother's place one Sunday to have dinner. And after dinner, Dad and I and Grandpa were sitting there, and Grandpa said, "I want to tell you something I don't want you to forget." I said, "Okay." He said, "You remember when we made sausage, butchered the hogs and made sausage?" I said, "Oh yeah, I remember that." I said, "That was, you made us do everything, us oldest grandkids, all the steps," and I went through the steps. And he was pretty pleased. And he said, "Do you remember when we made wine?" I said, "Oh, Grandpa, I don't like that stuff." And he said, "Well, you might someday." So he said, "Let's go through it." So he did. And he asked me then, after he was done, he said, repeat what I just said. Well, I couldn't do it. He said, "Let's go through it again, this time pay better attention." So I did. At least by the time I left there, I could repeat what he had told me. And I really had never had any intention of making wine. And like I said, it must have been about 5 years later, I was working in Seattle, and it was a little more sophisticated in Seattle, and I was living with a friend of mine that I'd went to high school and college with, and he was having a glass of wine for every meal. And so we kind of acquired an interest and a taste in it. And got married, met my wife there, got married, and we moved to Missoula, Montana. I worked for the U.S. Forest Service. That's what paid the bills for 37 years. And in Missoula, we found a lot of people that made their own wine from things like choke cherries, dandelions, yeah, anything they could do. And I thought, okay, I tasted somebody had some cherry wine. It was pretty good. And so I thought, maybe we'll use cherries. And a friend of mine had a cherry orchard on the south end of Flathead Lake. And so we went to Flathead and Lake and picked cherries. Mary and I brought them to our apartment, and we said, okay, now what do we do? So we sat there, and I don't know how many pounds of cherries we had, but we had 3 carboys, 5-gallon carboys, where we squished them with our hands, put them in a container and let them ferment. We thought they were fermenting. I used the formula that my grandfather used, which really wasn't right for cherries.
And I was teaching school at the time. And so the following Monday, I had to get up in front of my second graders, and my hands were just red. I mean, you want to talk about, I spent the whole day trying to write with chalk on the chalkboard like this because we had crushed the cherries with our hands. And it made some pretty awful wine. In fact, it was so bad that we agreed that the best thing to do was use it as drain cleaner, and we just poured it down the kitchen sink. It was awful.
Yeah, after that, there was a brew shop in Missoula, and catered mostly to beer, but it had some wine supplies. So I went down to the brew shop, cruised through it, asked the person there, the sales clerk, about wine, and they gave me this book, and it was The Art of Making Wine. And I still have some notes in it. And when I this was 1972. When I went through the book, I found the errors of my way. And with cherries and fruit and things like that, you really needed to add water, sugar, acid, that kind of stuff. But I found some recipes for Zinfandel and Moscato, and I recognized that. And I thought, okay, this looks pretty simple. This looks like what Grandpa told me, Grandpa and Dad told me. Well, the next fall, I went to Pacific Fruit and Produce. I thought there was a produce house in Missoula, and there was the same produce house in Walla Walla. That's where we picked up the grapes out of the train, and asked them if they could order some winemaking grapes. And at that point, they said, oh yeah, we order a lot of winemaking grapes for people. And so I found that some of my colleagues that I worked with got grapes out of California. Well, anyway, we got some Zinfandel. I followed the formulas, and it didn't turn out too bad. I mean, it was drinkable. It wasn't great, but it was drinkable. And to be honest with you, you look forward and say, well, I'm going to do this next year again, but maybe I'll do something a little different. And that went on for 30 years while we were in the Forest Service, moving around from Missoula to Portland, Washington, D.C., and back to Portland.
We always bought our houses based on whether or not it had a basement, because you needed a basement, to bring the grapes in. And our first house in Missoula was really only partially finished when we moved in. There were still a lot of things to do. And Dick left the grapes in the garage because he wanted them to stay cool. And he brought them down into the basement. And I should have brought it, that picture of you. He's in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt standing in my canning kettle with the grapes in the kettle, and he's squashing them with his feet and screaming bloody murder because the grapes were almost frozen. That's how cold it was. And I had to run up to the next level and get a bucket of hot water and bring the water down so he could put his poor feet.
I offered her to do it, and she said, no, you go ahead.
Well, thank you. I'm watching. I'm taking notes and pictures, too. But I think the reason why he really got into it is because one of my second grade students, her family was Italian, and every year they had a huge party, and he had a crusher. Was it a destemmer too, or was it just the crusher? Anyway, it was an old wooden one, and they would invite hundreds of people into their house on a kind of a, people come in and out, bring food, they'd go downstairs and they'd run the crank on the machine, and they invited us because I had, talked to my little students' parents and said, oh yeah, Dick is just learning to make wine, and they thought that, that would be great. So we went, and it was almost overwhelming. There were so many people in there, and they all wanted to crank the machine and everything, and, but it was a lot of fun. And so the following year, we decided we'd do the same thing in our basement. So we invited all the people from the Forest Service that we knew, and made a bunch of treats and stuff, and had people bring hors d'oeuvres and everything, and put some Italian music on, and they were down in these big buckets, hopping up and down and crushing the grapes. And they actually thought they were having fun. They didn't realize they were doing the work for us.
Yeah, I remember one lady we were sitting there looking at the boxes of grapes and eating some hors d'oeuvres, and she said, "You're really not going to step on those grapes, are you?" I said, "No, I'm really not." Says, "You are." And so she was kind of shocked, and I think she was the first one in the bucket finally. Because what we had people do was separate the grapes from the stems. We didn't have a crusher and destemmer. And I knew enough, I had read enough that we probably wanted to destem them. Well, that went on for every year, and that became an event. And it was fun. It was fun. We did that when we moved back to Portland, from Missoula to Portland, and then when we moved from
Portland to
Washington, D.C., and lived
then
in
back to Portland.
Yeah.
And every house had to have a basement.
Had to have a basement, yeah. So anyway, it became an event, and it was fun. Usually with people doing that, they'd never been to something like that before. And so that was always interesting.
So they drank and ate and
Yeah.
stomped grapes, and then we spent the rest of the weekend recovering.
Yeah. Well, what I found was that the quality of the grapes that I was getting when I was an amateur winemaker wasn't real good. And the quality of the grapes back on the East Coast was not real good either. They were French hybrid grapes. They were not vinifera. And they were low in sugar, high in acid. And you could take care of the sugar aspect by adding a little sugar, but the acid was hard to get down unless you added water, and I didn't like to do that. And I spent 4 years in Virginia and did a lot of reading, and everything said you can't make good wine without good grapes. And I thought, well, yeah, you can. Well, you can't, is what I found out. And I think the last year we were there in Virginia, I was ready to order some grapes out of California. And I think an offer came for a transfer back to Portland, and so I didn't make any wine in that year. Once I got back to Portland, I found some vineyards. This was 1985. I found some vineyards in the Willamette Valley that would sell to you, and some in eastern Washington and around Maryhill. And particularly, they had Zinfandel and Moscato, and I tried that. Like I said, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service for about 37 years and retired when I was about 58, and thought, I got to do something. Maybe I will make wine. And when we started running the numbers and what it takes to buy 10 acres, 20 acres, build a winery, anything like that, it got pretty expensive. And unless I borrowed a lot of money, and I thought, I've been through one good career. I'm not sure I've got enough life left for another one like that. So we ended up deciding to do what they call custom crush at an existing winery. After I retired, I tried to get into the wine industry to find out just exactly what it was all about. And I worked for Ponzi's in the tasting room, and they're very welcoming people. We got along just great. And I did that for 2 years and learned the marketing aspect of it, at least the sales aspect. I also joined a winemaking club that was called, at the time was called West Side Winemakers Club. And it was, they met every month at Oak Knoll Winery. Marge Volstecke, who owned the winery, her and her husband Ron, hosted this. And I thought it was really great. Marge was just a super person. And at these winemaking, at these monthly meetings, we had tastings, we tasted each other's wines, we could treat them. You were able to, talk to somebody else about, hey, I got this problem, what do you do, this kind of thing. And Marge was helpful too. And at these meetings, I met Peter Rosbach, who owns Shanann. And Peter was just getting started. And he'd bring his wines to the club and we'd taste them, and they were just super. So I asked Peter, I said, hey, I'd like to start doing some winemaking. And he said, well, come on over and help me. Okay, so I did that. At the time, he was at Medici Vineyards, and I went over and helped him with crush, bottling, and that kind of thing. I also helped my cousin, who is in Walla Walla. I helped him during one of the crush. He part-owned Walla Walla Vintners. His name was Gordy Veneri, and he had a partner named Miles Anderson. Miles was a teacher at the community college and actually started the, I think he started the winemaking program there. So I had all kinds of people that were mentors and could help too if I had any questions. And that was good. And finally, about in 2002, I had asked Medici if I could get a custom crush agreement with him, and I could. Hal and I got along very well. Both of us were first generation Italian, had very similar experiences growing up, and both of us graduated from the University of Portland. He in 1955, and mine was 64. And started out then. And what I did is, I knew what I wanted to do and how to make wine from, and what critical points there were. How to move around a ton or two was something else. And that's what I learned, that the forklift was probably one of the most important pieces of equipment in the winery. And so I kind of depended on Peter Rosbach and some of his staff to do the heavy work like the forklift, running the equipment. I really didn't want to run the equipment because every piece of equipment has a little bit of idiosyncrasy to it. And if it fails, you got to know how to fix it right away or get it back on track. So I brought in grapes that I'd purchased over in the Dalles and in Eastern Washington, brought them to the winery, and we processed them there. I made all the decisions. Mary and I did, I should say, made decisions like what yeast you were going to use, when were we going to inoculate it, how long we were going to leave it, the red grapes to ferment. And the grapes that I concentrated on were the heavy Bordeaux's, the Cabernet Sauvignons, Merlots, Zinfandels, Barberas. What Mary and I decided is, okay, if we're going to get into this venture, let's make something that we like. That way, if it doesn't sell, we've got something we like. So that's what we did. And that's kind of why I latched on to Peter Rosbach, because Peter did the heavy Bordeaux's and got his grapes out of the Dalles and Eastern Washington.
Well, I'm going to pick that up back there in a second, but I want to back up and talk about Mary. Let's talk about your time before meeting this man here. Tell us about where you were born and raised and kind of your life before Dick.
Well, I was born in Sendai, Japan. My dad was in the military. And I spent all of my years until I graduated from high school traveling. We lived in Japan and Panama, in Germany, and then we moved to Fort Hood, Texas, and moved back to Germany. And I think by that time I graduated. And so I graduated from the American military school in Nuremberg. And then I came out to the West Coast because my mother had a sister and brother-in-law who lived in Bremerton. So I went to school there for 2 years. And then I decided after 2 years of school that I needed a job. You know? And so I took the civil service test, and I was hired to work for the U.S. Forest Service. And that's where we met. As he was coming in to take over his job, I was leaving after a year, deciding that if I was really smart, I'd go back to school and finish my degree. So I went to the University of Washington. And I am a proud dog, and there is a flag in my front yard because I live in the middle of a duck pond.
And you've been wearing purple today.
Yes, I am. I do. Every once in a while, I irritate the neighbors. And so Dick and I started dating. Well, actually, he really only called me because he wanted tickets to the basketball game. Because at that time, that's when Lou Alcindor was playing. And so there were a lot of really, fantastic basketball players and football players. So he said, how about going out to dinner? So we went out to dinner, and then he said, can you get tickets for the football game? Sure, I can get tickets for the football game now. And the basketball game. But I always got a nice dinner with him. And so then, let's see, we got married and moved to Missoula, Montana. And I taught for 2 years there. And then we had our oldest son. And then we moved to Portland. And just as I was finishing up my paperwork so that I could teach in Oregon, I got pregnant and we had our second son. And I don't remember how long we were there, about 2 years, 3 years?
We were there
4
4 years.
4 years. And then we moved to Washington, D.C. And so I never really did work there. It was just too much to go through paperwork all over again, for my degree. And then when we moved back here, I worked for the Beaverton School District for 22 years as a children's librarian. And we have 2 sons. Neither one is interested in managing the wine, although the youngest one has no problems dropping by and shopping, as he calls it. He'll come in and say, I need a couple bottles because I'm going to a football coach's function and I need to, find where everything is. And we have 3 grandchildren. And we like to cook. What else do we? Oh, we like to garden. Right now we have how many tomato plants? 30? Because if one is good, then 30 is better.
50 times better.
Yes, right. And eggplant and peppers and zucchini. And the neighbors all wait for us to put our garden in because Dick doesn't put anything in until the ground is warm. So, I don't know, what else do we do? Right now we're binging on 8 seasons of a series on MHZ called Spiral. And we only have till the end of June, and we still have 3 more seasons. So we've got a lot of watching to do.
Good thing it's Cellar season.
Yes, exactly.
Tell me about your reaction to, or your introduction to wine. Was it? Did you have any knowledge or interest before meeting?
Absolutely not. The only wine I ever had any contact with was Ripple or Thunderbird or Strawberry Hill, whatever. Anyway, it didn't take much for me to realize that this was not not my wheelhouse. But it was for Dick when he started making wine. For me, it was more the history of his family, and just being able, by being married, to be a part of that. And I still didn't drink that much. I still don't, but I do know a lot about it. And, I don't have any problem sharing.
When I'm making a blend, and there's a blend over there that I gave you, and it's Cabernet, Merlot, Zinfandel, and Barbera, I will run it by Mary and one of my sons. They have good noses and good palates. And
no desire beyond.
As well as people at the winery, I'll use them too, but always with Mary and Dominic.
So tell me about, obviously, starting this as a second career. Tell me about sort of figuring out how to make it commercially. You mentioned kind of the size in terms of moving a ton of grapes around. Tell me about how to make it commercially, how to find people to buy it, and how to find enough grapes to make everything you want it to make. Well,
the grape sources, I had found some of them while I was still working for the Forest Service. Had Lonnie Wright, who owns the Pines 1852, and Lonnie would get me some grapes, Merlot, Cabs, and sometimes Zinfandel, not all the time. And so I had a source there. And in making the wine, I said, Peter Rosbach helped in that particular area. I kind of followed Peter's protocol the first couple of years. I knew what I wanted to do, and I would ask, okay, what are you going to do on the next step? And he'd say, he or his assistant winemaker would tell me. If it sounded reasonable, I just went along with it. There was no use for me to do something different or want something different out of the ordinary. What I found, and Peter's assistant winemaker, Aaron Berlin at first, and then Russ Hodgkins, who I probably spent the most time with, were very helpful. And if I was about to walk off a cliff, they would tell me. Not too many times, but there was things I wanted to try, and I said, well, I tried that, and it really didn't work very well, so I may or may not do it. But we had a little different styles. My style is to go ferment the wine totally dry, and I know Peter does that too. I leave my wines in the barrel for 2 years rather than 1 year or a year and a half. And it depends on the variety too. A lot of the Pinot Noirs, the lighter wines, you don't want to leave them in the barrel more than a year, maybe a year and a half. The heavier wines, or the Bordeaux's, can stand to be there 18 months to 2 years. And that's kind of what I do. I was surprised after the first bottling. I bought some high-end corks and bottles. And the very first thing I did was, after my bottling, was take a couple bottles of Merlot and Cabernet, brought them to Nick's restaurant here in McMinnville, and the wine steward was going through them. He said, "That Merlot's really nice." Oh, good. Poured him a glass of Cabernet, and he pushed it back at me. He said, "It's corked." I said, "What?" And I just about fell off the bar stool. And that's when I found out what corked was, TCA. And some of the corks were infected, and when you laid the wine on its side, it got into an infected cork. It had a bad smell. Well, I lived with that for about 2 or 3 years, and what I found out was that as I was going through tastings, and sometimes we had events where I might pour 12 bottles of Merlot, 12 bottles of Cabernet, and every one you smell, and sometimes the wine had no smell. It didn't have any bouquet. So it didn't have a bad smell, it just didn't have any smell. And what I found from reading is that that was corked, and it was maybe going to get worse. So I was looking at screw tops, and I really didn't want to do that. But at the time, this is 2004 or 5, the industry around here started finding the same thing, and they started going to screw caps. Peter Rosbach found this glass cork thing that I showed you earlier. And the glass corks were part of the German pharmaceutical industry, slopped over to the wine industry in Europe. And Peter came up with it now. I don't know if it was, Peter had spent some time in Germany, so I don't know if it was those contacts or not, or how he got that. But there aren't very many of us in the Northwest that use those. There are 4 or 5 wineries.
We had to get an import-export license.
Right. The first time I did it was import-export. I thought, oh my Lord, I think I paid somebody to do that. I'm not going to do it. And then Peter and I, and as well as some other wineries, made some consolidated purchases from the, it was an Alcoa company in Germany. It was an American company, but it was in Germany. So anyway, we've been using that ever since, and people are fascinated by it. I know that it permits the wine to age. I just opened a 2007 Zinfandel, and it was just wonderful. And
there's no air exchange.
There was some controversy about, well, if you use screw caps, is it going to age? And during my homemade wine days, that's kind of all I used. I didn't have access to corks. And I know that the wine aged. I don't know if it aged the same as it would with a cork, but it aged and it got better. So for me, that was not an issue.
Plus his wife that would go around going, Thunderbird, Ripple, you know, Boone's Ferry, whatever it was. Although a couple of years ago you did use screw tops, didn't you?
I did.
We couldn't get the glass. I think it was during COVID.
Yeah.
And it was just such a mess. Our stuff, our bottles, and our glass corks sat out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for a couple of months.
Yeah.
And then they
couldn't get into the ports.
They couldn't get into
During
port.
COVID, just fouled up everything.
And then when they did get into port, they sat there for another who knows how long because they didn't have anybody to work. So when were you supposed to bottle? In August?
Mm-hmm. But I've already got the glass and everything ordered.
All right.
It's sitting in Salem.
But the year that we couldn't get it, you didn't bottle until almost the end of November, which is, that's a long time in there. So
now, one thing I learned, and it was, don't make more wine than you want to get out and sell. Watch your inventory and the cash flow. And so I make about 400 or 500 cases, and I did 500 one year, and that pushed me a little bit because I'm retired. And
which means you would have to work.
That's about where we're at. The boys don't want to take it up, and it's just become a part-time job. And what my objective is to make a great bottle of wine that people enjoy, and it's accessible. It's not. It's mid-range priced, and so that's kind of where we're at.
What were your goals when you started? And is this about what you expected?
Yes, I wanted to make a great wine. My goal was probably start out small, see if I want to get big, and or if my boys wanted to take it over, and neither one of them did. So we started out small and concentrated on quality, high quality, and I think we met those.
You mentioned selling it, so obviously the biggest challenge is selling the wine. So what have you found to be successful in terms of selling wine?
Well, we self-distribute in Oregon. That's the only place I can self-distribute. And we self-distribute to some restaurants and some wine shops and mailing list. And the mailing list kind of finally took hold, and you got people coming back and they bring somebody with them and who wants to taste it. And so that's what I found is pretty successful. And the restaurants, some of the restaurants use a lot of it, a lot of wine, our wine, which is good. And we sometimes get purchases off of that. Somebody goes to a restaurant and says, gee, I tasted this wine, I got to have a case of it. Okay.
We could do that.
So anyway, that's...
We went to dinner one night to a place where he sells a lot of his wine. And the waitress that we had knew Dick because, you know, he brings some wine in and everything. And she would come rushing over and she would say, somebody just bought a bottle of your wine and they really like it. And all evening long, she's just back and forth, just like a little mouse. They bought another bottle of your wine. It was really cute, you know, and it just kind of made us feel good, you know, to know that this was happening. We got to see it.
It also, she would probably tell people, that's the winemaker. Here, you take this wine, that's the winemaker. Winemaker and his, both winemakers there. So anyway.
No, the cleaner.
And that's one thing I found, is that people really like to talk with a winemaker.
Yeah, they like to meet you.
They like to meet you,
you know.
talk to you. They like to hear your story.
That's why we're here today. So,
yeah.
You mentioned this being a heritage project in a way, you know, growing up around wine. So tell me about that connection to the heritage. Does it feel like you thought it would in terms of being sort of connected to your winemaking history?
Am I connected to it?
Does it feel like you expected it to, making wine like your parents and your grandparents?
Oh yeah.
Show him the back of your label.
The back of the label says something about that.
You don't have your glasses. You want me to read it?
I've highlighted it on the back of the label. It says, Salute to my parents and grandparents who passed along our Italian custom of winemaking. And that's kind of I thought I had to put that on there because I told Dad and Grandpa I really wasn't interested in that stuff.
Not making any wine.
And they were trying to tell me something, and I wasn't listening until about 10 years later.
But I think he'd be proud of, you know, what you did. And also from everything I've heard, your wine was a lot better than what came out of the basement there.
They did some risky things back then. They didn't use, I don't think they used yeast. I don't think they knew what sulfites were. They drained out of the barrel, and that's okay for about maybe the first 20 gallons, and after that it starts to get oxidized. And I can remember some of the wine tasting a little off, and now I recognize it as oxidized if they let it get down too long. And I know my Grandpa kept all the family wine in his cellar, and I don't remember any 5 or 10 gallon demijohns, but there were a lot of gallon jugs around that sometimes he drained into. And so I think as he got towards the bottom of the barrel, that he drained it out into gallons. A lot of that was word of mouth, and it was there was no internet, no anything like that. And like I said, I got all mine out of that book that I had. I mean, I started that, to be honest with you. There's another book I finally got, and that was Making Table Wine at Home, and that was from University of California at Davis. They put that out, and they had some good information. There were also some books. I took some courses at Chemeketa Community College, after I retired from the Forest Service, and that was very helpful. And of course, I had other people that I relied on, mentors, things like that.
What were the sort of the biggest lessons or the biggest sort of learning curves for you going from amateur winemaking to professional winemaking?
Good grapes.
Good grapes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you can almost smell the difference. You know, if you get something that's a little green, it just, you know, when you take that first taste, it's like, oh, this is not very good. Yeah, good grapes, and you have to be willing to pay for good grapes.
Yeah.
You know, we had friends that, you know, we picked from their vineyards, and some years we had really good wine, and some years it was not. It was just, you know, a lot of that is weather related too, and, you know, whether the farmer next door sprays his field with copper sulfite and ruins everything. But yeah, if you don't have good grapes, you cannot make decent wine.
I think also during the homemade days, I had control of everything. I would, the vineyard owner might call me, or I might go out to the vineyard and say, okay, it's ready, I can get some grapes now. Take them home, process them. Well, when you did it commercially, you had to wait in line, or you had to coordinate this. And I found that it was best to sit down days in advance and say, okay, here's I'm going to bring in X tons on this day, and can we do it? And we always did. We always processed them that day, and that was at least one thing. But you better be talking about what day you're going to bring them in, and then waiting in line or in turn for the press. So you have the grapes that are fermenting several days, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, and then it's time to press. And there's a line at the press too. So you've got to learn to negotiate and work yourself into that, because the wineries might have 100, 200 tons in there, and you're just a little small guy there. Yeah. And then barrels. Oh man,
We had more barrels at one time than we had furniture in our house.
No.
Oh, yes, we
that was
do.
homemade days. No, Mary, that's not.
When we moved to Washington, D.C., and the movers were unloading the truck to the house, and I was standing there, you know, pointing like, go this way or go that way. And the guy leans over and he says, there's an awful lot of wine in this truck, and I don't see any furniture. And I thought, yeah, well, that's because there isn't any furniture.
No, that's
It was, no, maybe, but let me tell you, there was. I have pictures.
yeah. Anyway.
You gotta have priorities.
Yes, you do, yes.
Well, barrels, commercially, you know, I started like a lot of the guys and had French barrels, and which French barrels to buy, and what toasts to have them on them, medium, heavy, light, whatever. And I think one year I even bought all new barrels and put all my wine in new barrels, and it was very good, but it had a lot of oak on it, and I wasn't sure how it was going to age, and I kind of experimented with that. I thought, I don't know how this is going to work. Eventually, what I settled on was French oak, some French oak, maybe 50% new, 50% used. You could work in an American oak there. There was some American oak here, built out in Lafayette by Rick DeFerrari, no relation to me. But it was, he used Pacific white oak, and they called it Oregon oak. And I liked that. It had a nice impact on the wine. And I'd work a couple of barrels of that in with my mix. But the barrels were always
Expensive.
They're expensive, yeah. The French oak was expensive. And the American oak was a little cheaper, but it's getting up there right now. And I didn't like some of the American oak, but found a supplier that gets their trees back in Virginia and Kentucky, and they're pretty good. Yeah.
And then he has
So
to
what I
figure
found-
out how to come home and tell his wife that he spent, how much? $5,000, $6,000 on 3 barrels? But that's okay.
No, maybe $1,000.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on, I have a couple questions about sort of the industry in the future, but before we move on, I'm curious about your other career. You talked about your career a little bit in the Forest Service and then in teaching. Dick, I'm curious about your time in the Forest Service. It's a long career. Give us a little synopsis of sort of what you were working on.
Well, I was started out when I was 18 years old. I had worked mostly in agriculture. If you were growing up in the Walla Walla Valley, you can't escape a job. There's all kinds of jobs there. There were jobs out in the garden, harvesting onions, lettuce, stuff like that. And then when I got old enough, I went to a bird's eye cannery, worked there for a couple of years. Wheat harvest, drove a truck with transporting wheat from the combine back to a silo. And then when I was 18, I went to work for the Forest Service on a fire suppression crew and worked at that for 4 years. And that was a challenge. I enjoyed it. It helped me get through school because on a year when we had a lot of forest fires, I made quite a bit of money. And went to work for them permanently after college. Graduated from the University of Portland in 1964. Started my career with the Forest Service, which was, now I wasn't a forester because they didn't have forestry program at University of Portland, but I was an administrator. Most of my jobs were in administration, personnel, procurement, that kind of thing. I was an administrative officer on a couple of national forests, one in Missoula, the Lolo National Forest, and one on the Mount Hood National Forest. And in Washington, D.C., I was in budget and worked with Congress quite a bit, answering what we call Q&As, lots of questions. They always had, you submit your, Forest Service would submit a budget and Chief would testify, and he'd come back with 600 questions that we had to answer. So that was a good involvement. Coming back out in the Northwest, I think I was the budget officer for the Oregon-Washington National Forest, and then after a short period of time, I became deputy regional forester for the National Forest in Oregon and Washington. And what that meant was there's about 24 million acres of national forest land all through Oregon and Washington. And my responsibility was oversight and leadership and that kind of thing. And that was a pretty challenging job. It was kind of like the administrative officer on an individual national forest, only I had 19 national forests on this. And that was fun, challenging. I almost quit mid-career. We were in Washington, D.C. My mother, I think, would have liked to have us stay in the Northwest. So she would send me these articles. This was 1983, 84. Send me these articles about wine in Walla Walla. And at the time, there were 2 wineries. I think there was Woodward Canyon and Leonetti. And I thought, this is going to go. This is about like the first time I tasted Starbucks coffee at the Pike Street Market in Seattle, and I thought, this is going to go. And it did. And the wine industry in Walla Walla did. But I also was just about to get into the executive ranks in the Forest Service, get to where I wanted to be. And I thought, nah, I don't want to throw it all away. Maybe after I retire. So that's what we did. We worked through it, and after retirement, then as I explained, I got into the winemaking.
What were your impressions of the wine industry in Oregon and in Walla Walla, especially when you came back to Portland for the kind of the last time? What did the industry look like as you were making wine here and starting to kind of familiarize yourself with the industry?
I think it was still kind of, it hadn't really taken off.
We came back in 1985.
Yeah.
And it somewhat had taken off.
Yeah. But not like it is today.
Not like it is today, or not like it was after I retired. It seemed like it mushroomed from about 1985 to 2000. There was a lot of wineries that came in, that popped up. And both here in the Willamette Valley, down in southern Oregon, and eastern Washington, and Walla Walla, and the Tri-Cities and through there. And I think in the 90s it just kind of mushroomed and kept on growing. I see it continuing to grow. Oregon still has places that I think you can grow grapes. You just got to find them. Both in the Willamette Valley and in eastern Oregon. I think eastern Oregon hasn't really been tapped that much yet, because you got large blocks of land that are owned by farmers that don't really want to break them up yet. And I'm not sure about southern Oregon, because when I lived in Grants Pass in the 60s, there were a lot of cherry orchards in Medford, and a lot of fruit. Some of those have been replaced with vineyards. And part of that is land that's available, because there is public land down there. And you can't put vineyards on public land. So I think it's, Oregon still has a ways to go. There's land if you can find it. Hopefully water if you need it. And in some cases you'll need water when you first plant it, I think. Plant the vineyards. So there's still a lot of room. We haven't got to the place yet where the water isn't safe to drink. and that's interesting too. I think in America here, wine is not like it is in Europe, where it's common. It's getting there. It's getting there. Mm-hmm. People are enjoying a glass of wine with their meals.
But it's not part of the culture yet.
Not part of the culture, yeah.
I mean, in Europe, that's just what they do.
And here you're competing with a lot of beer manufacturers, beer makers.
So in the time that you've been, obviously you mentioned coming back in 1985, right as the growth was just starting in the industry. What are the biggest changes you've seen amongst sort of Northwest wine, the wine industry? Obviously it's gotten a lot bigger. What else has changed about the industry?
Well, I think a lot of the big wineries from California coming up and buying out other wineries.
That's happened.
Yeah, I always say, and you can hit me if I shouldn't say it, but there are so many wineries around now that my theory is people think all you need is a bucket. And you can make a bottle of wine, you need a bucket and a few grapes. You need a lot more than that.
There's some work involved to it, that's right. Yeah,
it is, yeah. I used to, during Crush, when they would bring the grapes into Medici, I used to get out of the building as quick as I could and or into the bathroom and change into some really disgusting clothes and drive out to the winery so that I could help, because they always needed people up on the line, or usually they put the shortest person in the world below the ramp where the cases come down when they've bottled. And that would be me standing there like this, trying to stop them from, so after about a half an hour of that, I said, I'm done, I'm going home. But, it was just part for, 4 or 5 years. That's what I did, during Crush. And we used to try to talk the boys, but they always said, well, I got a football game, or I've got soccer, so it was just me. We did talk a few people into coming out and working, but I don't think they ever came back. See, that's the problem. It's a lot of work. It is, and somebody's always running the forklift with the, what do you call it, where the grapes are in. I've lost my... The bin, and they dump the bin in, and somebody's standing there with a fork pulling them down, and and you're trying to grab the leaves and the bugs and stuff that especially if they don't pick clean. You love it when you find a vineyard that picks clean. There's no tape or paper or bugs or anything like that. But our first couple of years, there was a lot of just really. Disgusting.
I watched the industry in '85 when it came back, because when we moved back to the Northwest, and there weren't as many wineries in the Willamette Valley. There were a few popping up, and then, like I said, from '85 through about 2000, you really found that there were folks coming in that wanted to start a vineyard and a winery more, and they thought that this was a great way of life, and it is, and I think you're going to see that continue for a while. There was a growth spurt there that I saw, that I thought after from '85 to 2000, that I thought I was going to miss and be too late, but I don't think we were. And I think you still see people coming in, buying land, planting vineyards, and trying to make wine. And you just got to find just the people in the United States here that will buy it. I mean, there's got to be, as Mary mentioned, it's not quite in the culture yet, but it's getting there. It's getting there. In Europe, like my aunt told me, it was part of food, and not a whole food, but it was a food supplement, and not quite there yet. But we'll get there. We'll get there.
What's next for the two of you and for the future of the brand?
We haven't really discussed the future of the brand, and what's next?
Well, we have, but we haven't come to a decision yet.
I don't think I'm going to start anything soon, anything different.
But I think it's hard to step away, don't you? I mean, this is what he's been doing, since what, 1998?
Since '98.
Yeah.
Anyway, people ask me and said, "How long have you been making wine?" And I'm thinking, "Gosh, 1972. That's 50 years." Not all of it was good.
Not all of it was good.
But we haven't discussed that yet.
No. But we do get from people when Dick went commercial, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people don't like you having parties where people stomp on the grapes. So we decided that it was best if we just sort of faded into the sunset, because we used to have these parties and you couldn't find a parking space in the neighborhood because there were so many people coming in and out and drinking and, eating lots of good food and dancing to Italian music and everything. And So when Dick got his commercial license, we actually had to step back from that, and we didn't make a big deal about it. And then we realized that people we hadn't seen for a while would come up and say, "Hi, are you guys still making wine?" "Yeah, we're still making wine." Oh, okay, well, did we miss your party?" It's just embarrassing, that we did this, because it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. But then to have to explain to all these people that, oh, we can't do this anymore, because we get in trouble.
No, we don't do that anymore, but you can come out and buy it.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say that this house has probably been the best one for making wine as an amateur, because behind the garage there's another totally full room, so that's where all of his stuff was fermenting. And then he realized that the laundry room, so if this was the garage, the laundry room is here. So he drilled a hole in the wall and then put the barrel up against the laundry room wall, and then tubes.
True gravity.
Gravity flow. So I'm downstairs hollering up, "Stop!" And he's pushing, wine is coming down. It was, that was a real interesting experience.
Some wineries that are built on gravity
Yeah,
flow.
gravity flow. But we have our own,
we have.
just a hole in the wall and a couple in the laundry room of all places. As a matter of fact, that's where everything is. It's down in the laundry room. Cases of wine. And
It's true dedication.
it is, it really is.
True dedication.
But, it's been fun. It's been a ride, and it's. I said at the very beginning that, he's the winemaker. I mean, he's the one that goes out, 2 or 3 times a week and checks things and everything like that. And I'm kind of the gopher, when we have an event, I'm the one out talking to people and picking up glasses and washing them and making sure that there's still food on the table, and running into people that we haven't seen for a couple of years, and just so that's kind of fun. You get to meet all kinds of people,
Sure.
new people.
Well, that's all the questions that I have.
Okay.
Is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have? Anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to cover?
I don't think so.
Covered it all?
No, I think you did a good job. That was
thank you.
lots of,
They all write the questions. So
yeah,
I'll send
awesome,
them to you.
very nice, yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
for sharing your story
Welcome,
with
thank
us.
you for asking us, yeah.
Go ahead, let you off the